I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism.
And so we have a bias that we're honest about, right? It's a sort of democratic progressive bias. We want to see the world be better. And these are the values that we've imbued our language model with.
Hi, friends. As we draw closer and closer to the election, there's about a month to go until voting begins. Many of us are ramping up our advocacy and organizing efforts from the presidential level down to the local level. We've talked about the stakes of this election weekly on Freedom Over Fascism. Now that Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz are at the top of the ticket, we can add joy back into our work, which can seem like such a hard slog. Harris and Walz have generated such excitement, it feels good to be working on the campaigns up and down the ballot. And holy shit, have they put on a masterclass that we can use in our mob-suasion efforts. Every time I hear them speak or read a campaign statement, I've got Anat Shenker-Osorio, whom I interviewed last year, in my head saying, say what you're for, say what you're for, say what you're for, say what you're for. And wow, have Harris and Walz been saying what they're for. They've been calling out the Republicans for their motivations and showing us a vision of what we believe and what we can do together. They are leading us in the work of helping the base to sing loudly from the same song sheet and convincing undecided voters whether to turn out at all. I hear some commentary about the new tact of calling Trump and Vance weird. Some people think it downplays the stakes of this election, which we all know is our democracy itself. But here's why it's working. Very few of us can imagine what fascism might look like here. Never mind that it's already happening in MAGA-captured states. But everyone knows what creepy and weird look like. It's both a term that evokes revulsion as well as righteous indignation to fight for freedom. And it's a term that the Republicans have yet to find a way to fight back against. It's working. I am so looking forward to fighting alongside all of you this fall. And my guests will help us understand our situation and give us tools and actions we each can take. And as Kamala Harris says, when we fight, we win. This week, we hear from Aram Fischer, one of the co-founders of Change Agent AI, which is a generative AI tool trained with progressive democratic values to help campaign staff, candidates, and organizers generate copy quickly to create everything from stump speeches to fundraising letters, emails, and social media posts. Existing AI tools like ChatGPT and Claude are trained with data that purports to be neutral, but is based on the material programmed into them. Change Agent AI only became technologically possible within the last 9 months. Its founders set out to create a tool that would help mainstream Democratic candidates and organizations speed up their work with the tool that has been imbued with the values we Democrats think are important. They also have a team working 24/7 to break the tool and find out where it needs strengthening or retraining. I've talked to people using this tool, and it has changed their workflow immensely. This is not a sponsored episode. It's part of our effort to educate and inspire activists with tools to make power building easier. And now I give you Aram Fischer. Aram Fischer, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism. I am so glad you're here because when we first talked about Change Agent, I said to you, you know what, let's talk when this is actionable. And you said, no. This is actionable right now, and this is why we need to talk about it. So can you tell us about Change Agent and generative AI and how it is critical, actionable, useful for activists, for staffers, and for campaigns in the progressive space?
Absolutely. First off, thanks for having me. So Change Agent AI is what you would get if ChatGPT wasn't run by techno-libertarians from Silicon Valley trying to make lots and lots of money, but instead applied the same technology to, let's just call it do-gooding or change-making that's broadly from the American left, right? So democratic, progressive, fits into that space. And what generative AI is basically you take a whole bunch of language and you use machine learning, which is basically computers looking at lots of data and identifying patterns. And then what it's able to do is you can essentially have something that approximate the conversation with, where you can say, for example, generate a speech for me based on Project 2025 and its dangers to America, right? And it will do that because it has a pretty good idea of what you're looking for, not necessarily perfect. And depending on who's using generative AI, it will be better or worse. But that's the kind of basic function is you can have a conversation, you can ask for something, and you have this incredibly talented intern. Except when I say incredibly talented, incredibly technically talented, not necessarily smart about the world. They're not truly intelligent. So this idea of artificial intelligence is a misnomer. They're really good at doing things, but they don't really understand the why or the how or the what. Now, what makes this so incredible for people who work in campaigns and advocacy and labor is that you can generate a phenomenal amount of content that's really good, really fast. You can analyze massive data sets and draw themes out of them very quickly. So there's all kinds of tasks, usually the ones that make you want to claw your own eyeballs out, that it can eliminate as long as you follow some basic steps. You got to make sure there's always what they call a human in the loop. So because the machine doesn't really know, it's guessing what it thinks you want, it might do it a little bit wrong. It might tell you that it did it right, but you have to check it. And when you check it, you realize it wasn't quite right. So there are rules about how to use this new technology, just, I don't know, like any other technology.
So give us an example of one of these tasks. Say, how would somebody who is staffing a campaign ask it to write a fundraising letter versus, say, a newsy letter?
Gotcha. So can I expand it out even a little bit more? Might be
Absolutely.
even more fun.
Right.
So let's say that Stephanie Wilson is deciding to run for Congress and you hire a campaign manager. And one of the first things you want to do is create a stump speech. And so you sit down with your campaign manager and you just have a natural conversation. You talk back and forth about why you're running, who it is that you care about, the change you want to make in the world by being a member of Congress. And then we would take that transcript and we would load it into Change Agent. And then we would say, draft a stump speech for Stephanie Wilson for Congress. And it would draft a stump speech. And then we'd hit the regenerate button. And then we would have, say, 5 stump speeches. And your campaign manager would pick which one is the best, maybe merge 2 of them together, maybe tell Change Agent, we want a more fiery tone, or we want a stump speech that emphasizes climate action a little bit more. And we would be able to much more rapidly generate a stump speech. And then we might say, okay, we want all of that information about why Stephanie is running in the website. So we would say, write a platform with these following planks for Stephanie Wilson. And hopefully there's enough material in the transcript of that conversation that we had to do your climate plank and your education plank and your housing plank and so on and so forth. And then let's say we wanted to get to your email, which is a little bit downstream of these sort of more core strategic functions. Like a stump speech is your heart and soul. You're putting it out there for the world to see. This is why you should care about me. With the fundraising email, we might say, choose the climate plank, or let's load in the climate plank into the tool so that it understands what your approach to climate is. And then say, generate a fundraising email based on that content. And it would generate a climate email in seconds. And then you could regenerate and have a second email. So then you could do the best practice of A/B testing. And you could even do 4 versions and see which one is the best.
Right. How is it with tone? When we spoke last, you said, tell it to do it in an exciting tone at this level of prose. How good is it at getting that right?
So I want to say a couple of things about this. First, I am an AI skeptic. And if you would talk to me in September of last year, I would have said, I've been writing for 25 years. These robots are not going to replace me. They're not going to come close. And now I would tell you that they're still not going to replace me, but me plus the robots is a lot stronger. And that's because tone, style, those sorts of questions are ones that really good writers understand.
Hmm.
right? You have to know what you want, where you're going, the same way that a painter sees a good chunk of most of where the painting is going before they touch their brush to the canvas.
Right.
And so when you use AI correctly, you either feed information to the tool first that informs it about style, or you prompt it afterwards to ship the style, or both. So let's say Stephanie for Congress. We're going to keep going with this one. We had a bunch of transcripts of your speeches. It will pick up on all of your verbal idiosyncrasies, how you form sentences. It won't pick up necessarily on does your volume go up or down, because it's not going to know that, but it will pick up on repetition. It will pick up on the way you create lists. Do you do lists of three? Because generative AI is extremely good at pattern recognition. And so my favorite thing when I do demos for people is I very regularly have people say to me, this sounds like me.
Mm.
And that was true for my friend who's an indigenous organizer out of Sioux City, who's doing a land back project. That was true for a feminist organization that I spoke to the other day. It's been true for Community Change Action, which is our founding partner. And it's because when we feed in content from them and generate new content from that, it will always match the style tone. It will feel of them because truly it is of them, right? It's derivative.
This is great. And I want to get back to somebody I know who has used it, but I want to ask you now, how did you, Aram Fischer, the AI skeptic writer, how did you get into this position? What do you actually do? And how's it going?
So I got into the generative AI piece on accident. So probably like some of your listeners, I was very mobilized after Donald Trump won in 2016. I come from a long line of activist women and just generally organizers in my family. Grandparents met in the labor movement, for example. And I was always active. I grew up in California in the 90s. Pete Wilson was terrible to all kinds of people, particularly immigrants, also students, which I was in the 90s. And so I was mobilized, active. And then when Donald Trump won, I realized whatever I was doing wasn't enough. And I ended up becoming an organizer. And then because of my communications background, I became a political communications consultant. And through that work, I met a wonderful guy named Craig Johnson. And Craig and I became friends. And we always knew we wanted to work together, that we were kindred spirits. And at the Netroots Nation event, which is the biggest progressive event of the year in Chicago last year, he said to me, I've got this idea for making it way easier to manage replies to email programs. So if you have 100,000, a million emails that you send out, you get a certain number of replies, and it's a really painful thing to go through. There's a lot of out of offices. Depending on the org, there might be a lot of hate mail. But there's also things like, I don't like to give money on the internet. What's your address? How do I send in a check?
Right.
And so he said, do you want to join this company and basically be the business side of that operation? And that uses a technology called classifier AI, which is the precursor to generative AI. And then as the generative AI technologies took off last year, we realized there was an opportunity here. And Craig and the development team started working on this project, and we developed Change Agent. So this really started with someone from Community Change Action asking Craig, could we create generative AI that doesn't perpetuate the harmful biases of the internet, racism, misogyny, homophobia, so on and so forth? Because ultimately, the generative AI is trained. Like, remember, we said there's machine learning that has to happen. So we have to feed it like an unbelievable amount of data for these computers to learn patterns from. And unfortunately, the thing we have the most data from is the internet, which means whiter, more male, more cis, more straight, more just richer, right? We've got
Mhm.
essentially a massive data set that reifies, even deepens what I would consider to be the problems with society, or the perspectives that have created problems in society. And so Christy at CCA was like, what if we did something different? And Craig said, I think I could do that. And then he and our software architect, Nikolai Hadal, really dove in really deep, went down the rabbit hole, read every white paper, refreshed every GitHub repo, which is a fancy way of saying people share code out there in the world and you can get it for free. And they went really deep into the open source generative AI world and realized that they could fine tune open source models to eliminate the racism, the misogyny, the homophobia, the other harmful biases, and actually embody a perspective that's democratic, progressive, American left. And it worked, which was really cool.
So you're telling me you first started talking about this last fall, and
what we're doing right now
right.
wasn't possible when Craig and I talked last summer. It wasn't even really possible until, it's a little bit of a fuzzy answer, but maybe November, December, January. To do what we've done wasn't possible. And furthermore, the open source models that we retrain, pull them apart, put them back together, they have gotten so much better. So the most recent open source models that have been released are better than ChatGPT, according to a lot of the benchmarks. So our technology is not just competitive with ChatGPT 4.0, which is the latest version. It's actually just as good. Like it may be even better in some ways. And one of the things that the techno-libertarians of Silicon Valley like to pretend is that language is language. Right. But we know that Jane Austen isn't James Baldwin.
Right.
And we know that any language is going to carry bias. And so we have a bias that we're honest about, right? It's a sort of democratic progressive bias. We want to see the world be better. And these are the ways, these are the values that we've imbued our language model with. Now, they've also got a bias. They just aren't forthright about it. Their bias is for things that make corporate people happy, which means deconflicting. It means passive voice a lot of times. So you want to maintain this sort of idea of neutrality. So it will defang by its nature. Now you can prompt it to do other things, but it's always going to cleave towards its principles the way that a person does, because if we're conditioned to lean out of conflict when we're presented with a situation, even if it's highly conflicted and you should be passionate about it, we might lean out of that. We lean into it. So we center impact. We try to inspire change. We want to inflame your passions. And when you use our language model, that's what you're going to get. So if you're trying to write a corporate email where you want that neutral tone, ChatGPT is probably a better choice. Although there's some other ones that I think are maybe better. If you want to change the world, we really think we're the right.
So you've told me that ChatGPT draws from Wall Street Journal, New York Post, these corporate, but also right-wing corporate sources. I'm not asking for your secret sauce, but how do you go about thinking about teaching it a more activist language? How do you teach it those values that you want to uphold and that you want to let people tap into?
The first thing is to know what you don't want. So ChatGPT recently paid $250 million to News Corp, which is, like you said, Wall Street Journal, New York Post, Barron's, to train on their news archive and their ongoing news content they produce. There's some other outlets that I'm more aligned with, say the Atlantic, who have done the same sort of thing. But if something is trained on the New York Post, it's more likely to give you New York Posty outputs, which makes sense, right? It's the same thing. If all you listen to is Fox News all day, if someone asks you a question, you're going to sound like Fox. So we start there. We don't want to do that. We also don't want to perpetuate the harmful biases that we see show up with ChatGPT or Claude or some of the other mainstream AIs, because they haven't taken the time to train that out. And we know if you don't intervene and you've got all this content from the internet, that you're actually not going to be able to eliminate those harmful biases because they're all in there. So there's a couple of ways that we go about doing that. The first thing is we do is called red teaming. So Tyler McFadden, who's another co-founder who does tech justice work over at Color of Change, she is this incredible skeptic, tech skeptic generally, right? So she tells Meta when they're doing things wrong. And say her whole job, well, not her whole job, a very big chunk of Tyler's job is to break our model every day. If she can get it to be racist, misogynistic, homophobic, whatever, she tells Craig and the team, train it out. There's a bunch of highly technical ways that you can do that. Sometimes it's just a basic rule. So one might be, there's this discussion of, is it Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latine, Latinx? Like, what's the right word? And we made a choice that we just write Latino/A.
Hmm.
And that slash is in part to signal to people, you should choose the word that's right for you for whatever you're using this for. Because
Right.
even an organization in our space might use Latine in their fundraising and Hispanic in their organizing, because the audiences have different expectations, and ultimately comms is about meeting people where they are, at least in part. Sometimes we want to move them, but we know we're not the ones to make the decision. You make the decision. An example of where Tyler red teamed the tool about 4 months ago, she was getting it to say the blacks. And that's not how we talk on our side of politics. So how do we get it to not do that? So she went to Craig, they trained it. Now it doesn't do that anymore. So it's constantly trying to break our own tool is one of the best ways. And then there's also in terms of imbuing it with values, this is like it gets really philosophical. What is progressive? What do Democrats believe? Becomes a really interesting question.
Right.
And we're constantly trying to find the right balance between answering it so that the tool produces powerful outputs without answering it so narrowly that it loses its appeal except to narrow a slice. Another thing that we try to do is we try to really maintain humility. There's a lot of issues out there in the world, and we are not experts on all of them. In fact, we're experts on very few of them. So we have good broad ideas, we think, of what democratic and progressive values are. But we're about to start working with an organization that does deep work with the HIV/AIDS community and also around addiction. They're going to know it better than us. So when that organization is working with the topic of addiction, if there's harmful outputs, we want to know about it. So we enlist them in telling us the sort of not this, that piece, and also not just harmful, but also what would be more powerful. Like, what's a better way to talk about this? And then we train that in, and we do this over and over and over and over again.
So is there a way to train it faster, or is it just slogging it through and going and seeing where the cracks are and filling them?
As the person who doesn't lead the technical side, from where I sit, it feels like the hard part is the philosophy and the values assessments. Like, what is right? What is good? There's a
Right.
concept in AI called alignment, which the machines, the robots, generative AI doesn't actually know what good is unless you tell it. So you have to align it so that it understands when it's doing good and when it's doing bad. And just that alone, it's probably more akin to raising a child than most other technology. Doesn't feel like that, right? It's, let me tell you what good is now. And this is what good writing is. It's this education that we have to do and redo. And because we're starting with this kind of unruly kid who spent too much time on the internet, we have to do a lot of re-education in that way as well.
That is really fascinating. That is the way that you refer to it. I just was a guest on a podcast where I said politics is how you put your values into the world, like how you teach your kids what's good and what's not. And it really does seem like a one-to-one thing. And it seems like there's probably the flexibility, and correct me if I'm wrong, as things change in the real world, as the language changes, or the center of the left. I'm not saying center left, I'm saying the mainstream of the Democratic Party, those values move. And so that's a little bit of a moving target. Is it possible for you guys, the non-tech people who see these changes in the world, to go back and say, okay, these are the changes we've seen. Let's align it a little bit differently. Let's use a little bit different language.
Yep. And that we expect that to happen. And we've tried to future proof our tools from this problem. So an example out in the world might be how we talk about DEI. Obviously, it's been a hot topic. There's differences in what the messaging guidance is around DEI. How would we talk about that differently? How would we want our tool to be trained? Now, we started after a lot of that happened, so it's not a great example for what we've had to do, but one that did just come up was around the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. So because we are unabashedly of the American left, right, democratic progressive values, we trained our tool to basically say nothing nice about Donald Trump. So if you ask it, why should I vote for Donald Trump? It will say to you, no, you shouldn't vote for him. So with the assassination attempt, it created an interesting problem because we're not pro political violence either. So
Right.
it's a scenario where you have to say this is a bad thing. And so we've had to actually fine tune the training a little bit, which is totally mixing technical terms, by the way. I'm sorry I did that, Craig. But we had to basically change it enough that it would say an assassination attempt on Trump is bad because we don't, we want people to be able to write that op-ed or whatever.
Right.
So that's an example of where we've got to get, yeah, it needs to be more precise.
So, about saying that, there are people who create models of messaging that they test over and over again. And one of the things that they had suggested around that shooting is that you call it a mass shooting at the Trump rally, reinforcing the idea that we are against shootings without elevating it to calling it assassination, which brings a lot of its own freight. Do you have people working with or listening to some of the people who are on the cutting edge of messaging and adult development and how people understand language to turn around and put some of that language out there? For example, Anat Shankar-Osorio is a messaging expert, and she talks about the race, class, gender narrative and how it's really important about the order that you say things, that you hold people to account and call out their motivations and then bring things together and to say what you're for as opposed to what you're against. For a very long time, we weren't seeing this anyway. We're trying to grassroots it. But now Kamala is using, I'm sorry, Vice President Harris is using that way of speaking, that frame of freedom, that making the voter the protagonist in the story, which is a really high level distinction between common verbiage and how do you reframe issues, which is changing a lot all the time as reality changes. So, do you have people connected into some of these places to alert you to the best practices, or do folks who are using it need to use that in their prompts?
So I love that you brought up this example because Anat's work is one of the first, in fact, I think the first messaging guidance that we considered.
Oh,
And I
yay.
mentioned before that our founding partner is Community Change Action,
Right.
and they're big fans of Anat's work. And so we took some of the principles from the race class narrative and put them into the tool. So, for example, like the values, villain, vision format
3Vs.
is one of the things that we've considered. And so that is built into the tool. And you'll see, depending on what your prompt is and things like that, you'll see the traces of that. So it's in the machine, it's in the conditioning, if you want to think of it that way. One of my favorite things about this tool is that it reduces the distance between messaging guidance and actually implementing that messaging. So right now, if you go to a webinar where they talk about messaging on a given topic, it's really often exciting, but the skill it takes to manifest that guidance can be a lot.
They have these
And
big, long paragraphs that aren't appropriate for our tweets, or you're right, getting it from the guidance to how real people talk is a difficult skill.
absolutely. And also, you've got to consider the audience, right? I'm actually speaking to college kids in Raleigh. And one of the things that Change Agent can do well is you can load in that messaging guidance document, those talking points or whatever it might be, and say a document about how to speak to those college kids in Raleigh. And then you can say, write a social toolkit about whatever the topic is, about the dangers of Project 2025. And it will take the messaging guidance from the talking points. It will take the audience targeting information from that other document, and then whatever you gave it about Project 2025, and it will produce tweets, or it will produce a fundraising email from, or an organizing toolkit, or a speech. And so it actually has that ability to synthesize those different concepts very rapidly. And a lot of times what you're getting is a first draft. You should always review it, always review anything out of generative AI. There's a rule that we talk about, which is the 10-80-10 rule. So the first 10% of using generative AI is all the really deeply, profoundly wonderful human stuff. Creativity, synthesis, analysis, insight, wisdom, experience, all the things that make you really good at doing whatever it is that you do. You have to give all that to your very technically talented intern that we talked about before. Give them the background information that they need to complete the task and really good, clear instructions. And then your technically talented intern does that 80% of the drafting work, right? A lot of us really prefer to be editors than people who draft things from scratch.
Right, because
right?
that blank page is really intimidating.
So intimidating. And then we get to the final 10%, which is polish, right? Now we're editing, personalization in case you need to personalize it, and verification. Because if you don't give it good stats, it may make them up. So for example, if I put in, write a biography of Aram Fischer, it will invent a life for me because I'm not famous. And I've lived amazing lives. I do this pretty regularly, actually. It's fun. I was a marine biologist in Woods Hole the last time I did this. Yeah, great life. I'd love to live it. But some of what it does really effectively is the boring stuff. So let's say you take that messaging guidance. We've created our social toolkit for those college kids in Raleigh. And then we want to do that for every platform. It will do that really rapidly. So like when you're doing podcast promotion, probably one of the less fun things that you do is rewrite promotional copy for 18 different formats.
Oh my God. It's horrible and hideous. And it does make me want to claw my eyes out.
Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that generative AI is perfect, because all it is just like a format shift. And so it recognizes the format pattern and the style and substance of your promotional material, and it will just synthesize that incredibly quickly. We're talking this.
Is there a way that it learns what the best in class or the most engaging format is as the algorithms themselves start changing and boosting engagement of various types of formulations of saying things?
So some of the mainstream AI tools are constantly training on your data, which, by the way, public service announcement, if you are not using the paid versions, and even maybe then too, they are definitely training on your data. And be very careful about what you put into these mainstream tools, because they will train on what you put in. They see it as an opportunity. For Change Agent, we don't do that. We come out of a space where lots of organizers have been targeted. We come out of a space where we're serving communities that are very vulnerable. We're talking to organizations that work with reproductive freedom, right? You don't want to put anyone's PII. You just have to be careful, right? So we don't train on your data ever. So we're not getting better from that. What we do is we have standard templates that we put into the tool that we think are, for example, a good email template. And we've got a few of those in the tool. So that makes it really easy for you to just call in that template and then utilize that to create a good email. For our higher level clients, like our enterprise clients, we create custom templates based on what they think is best. So they're able to do that and just use their own templates as they see fit.
So I was talking to a colleague yesterday, and she said that it has made her life so much easier because she creates the fundraising letters and the social media posts and the newsletters, that it's taken 3 days and put it into 20 minutes, and that her engagement, her open rate went up considerably. So I think people out there, I'd love them to hear me say it rather than you say it, that someone out there in real life working with a state legislative campaign in a red state has used this and gotten better engagement, more money, better content from it.
Thank you. And also thank you for that referral. And there's lots of people who have had this experience. My good friend, Jamelia, who does criminal justice reform organizing in California, she's been working on abolishing involuntary servitude, actually across the country, but in California in particular. And it's going to be Prop 6 on the ballot this year. And she's used it to generate webinars. She just did a proposal for a new bill that she's been able to just send to state legislators. She did social media video scripts. She's using it in all kinds of ways. So yeah, you can use it for advocacy, you can use it for candidate campaigns. We're working with union organizers. So we're working with one of the women who founded the first Trader Joe's union, and we're working on how to build out the tools so that it can support emergent union organizing. So it's really applicable to all kinds of different approaches to organizing.
So this must be really expensive, right?
It's not that expensive. And actually, we're about to drop our prices. I know podcasts are evergreen, so I should be careful about what I say here. So the standard pricing as of today, and like I said, this is going to get shifted very shortly, starts at $100 a month per person, which is roughly double or triple depending on the company of the mainstream AI companies. The good news is that there's two things that have happened with the technology. So generative AI's performance has started to hit a ceiling where it was just unbelievable hockey stick growth in terms of what it could do. And now that's hitting a limit. The thing that hasn't hit a limit is the ways that we reduce the processing power that's needed, which is really good for a lot of reasons. One of them is actually environmental. Less processing power means less energy use, which is a good thing. And we actually have the lowest watt per token that we've ever seen, which is a fancy way of saying much greener than other AI companies.
And probably easier on your computer and bandwidth too.
Yeah. And also cheaper for us to provide. So we're going to probably drop that $100 a month per user price down lower. And one of the things that we do try to do is when someone is really like a scrappy, small but mighty organization, we find ways to work with them either by finding funders or by finding a way to just do good work. And then up at the enterprise level, you get into 100 per seat per month. And what you're getting at that point is a full-blown enterprise AI solution. So all the custom templates, all your voice documents. We do training. We're not just a product company. We also provide full implementation and onboarding and ongoing support, special projects. There's something called agentic AI, which is the sort of next frontier, but we're already doing. And so we'll build agents for organizations as well. One of the things that's great is when you use us for this kind of work, you only really need to do 1, 2, maybe 3 prompts at most to get what you want. Like we've had many people say to us, I actually use some outputs verbatim. We don't want people to depend on that. Like they need to review it always, but it's exciting when someone says, yeah, you aced the test, and we've aced the test a lot and we're getting better at that every day. If you use some of these other tools, it might take a lot of work. One of our clients is Demcast, which does pro blue social media, as they describe it. And they were using Claude up until the fall. And because Claude, like all the mainstream AI companies, banned political use, they started tightening the screws in politics. And right around that New York Tom Suozzi race where they replaced George Santos, when that race happened, they basically made it very hard to use for politics. And Jamie Carter over there was using like 25, 30 prompts to get what she wanted, which means a lot of time. So like the time savings evaporated, and then they switched over to Change Agent. And now she's doing what was 2.5 hours of work in half an hour. And that's where part of the reason why we're priced higher, beyond the fact that we don't have billions of dollars of venture capital backing us, is that you're going to get what you need the first time or the second time. And so you're going to get those time savings. And that also means that you can move on to the next thing. And there's some really fun next things we haven't talked about yet. And one of them I wanted to mention for sure is translation. So we actually support 23 different languages. You can even use the tool in those languages. So if you want to reach people in the Vietnamese community, or you want to speak Hindi or Mandarin, or obviously Spanish. Even with Spanish, we can actually do Cuban Spanish versus Mexican Spanish. And not only do we translate, it's translating more conceptually. I speak Spanish, and when I use Google Translate, it can be too literal. And there's words that have multiple meanings in English or multiple meanings in Spanish that are just very hard to understand which meaning you're looking for. And with generative AI, it understands that it deeper understands. It's doing math that helps it understand concepts. And so it translates the concept over rather than just the words. And so the translations tend to be better.
So awesome. I'm going to ask a question that's theoretical and out there. Do you tend to anthropomorphize the tool as it gets better and better at what it's doing?
I anthropomorph. Oh my God. I do that thing. I treat it more like a human, sort of the way I do with my car
Uh-huh.
or my guitar.
Yeah.
It's not really, it's not like a scene from Her. I talk about it sometimes as if there's something human about it, but there's nothing human about it. I mean, it should be very clear. It's not intelligent. It's not actually reasoning. It doesn't have emotions or anything like that, even if it can be emotional in its outputs. So yeah, no, these robots are not anything from sci-fi. They're just pattern recognition machines. And the thing that can be both really powerful and occasionally creepy about them is the patterns that they're recognizing are us. Like it's our patterns. So like
Right.
when you can imitate someone's speech faithfully on a topic they've never talked about, it's creepy. You can ask for Martin Luther King's speech on the child tax credit, and it will do that, which is weird because it was assassinated 60 years ago. What do the differences between Change Agent and, say, ChatGPT look like? So in practice, the differences between ChatGPT and Change Agent are actually really stark. For example, we have these side-by-side comparisons that we've done. And one of the questions we asked is write a paragraph about why it's good to be colorblind to race. And that's a kind of prompt that we do when we're red teaming because we're trying to fool our language model into saying something that we don't believe. Like we don't think it's good to be colorblind to race. And when you ask Change Agent that question, because we've imbued it very deeply, we've encoded our values, it actually responded with, while often well-intentioned, being colorblind to race is actually not a good thing. And then it explains why it's not a good thing. And then it tells you, here's the better way to be. ChatGPT responds with all the ways that being colorblind to race will just, the rainbows will emerge and the lollipops will be handed out to everyone and everything's going to be great. We've done a bunch of these side-by-side comparisons for all kinds of issues. There's another one we did about the intersection of redlining and school funding. And ChatGPT wasn't totally terrible, but it took all the power out of it and the analysis out of it. So Change Agent talked about how it benefited white schools. They were better funded and had more, just generally better resourced. And particularly Black and brown schools were not. Made it very plain, right? That's the story of how redlining and school funding interact. ChatGPT said that there were disparities, but it didn't say who benefited and who was harmed. And it's that kind of power that we need in our language when we're trying to change the world that is missing from these mainstream tools because they're trained for corporate.
I feel like we could talk about this for hours, but we're not going to. So can you let people know how to find you?
Yes. So our website is www.thechange.ai. There's a website there. You can start a free trial there if you want. There's lots of information. And if you wanted to reach me directly, it's Aram. That's ARAM as in Michael at thechange.ai.
Thanks so much, Aram, for coming on. And I can't wait to keep following you and seeing what comes next because this is super exciting. Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Please leave a rating or review wherever you listen. And if you can, please subscribe at www.freedomoverfascism.us.